Inflation really does trump all. In the CNBC poll, I think 44% chose it as one of their top two most important issues.
I think we're going to have historically high turnout. I think turnout in 2022 will be higher than it was in 2018, both nationally and in a lot of these competitive races.
The other thing that we're doing is being more aggressive about how we weight our surveys.
November 8th is the midterm election. To learn more about the trends shaping the vote, we brought on a special host, Jarrett Lewis, who is a partner at Public Opinion Strategies. He interviewed Jay Campbell, a partner at Hart Research Associates, and Jim Hobart, also partner at Public Opinion Strategies.
Whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, I'm of the belief that persuasion very much still matters.
Jay and Jim discussed the top political issues for voters, like inflation, abortion rights, immigration, and crime.
Inflation is up, we have interest rates up, and we have the market down.
However, healthcare doesn't seem to be a top issue for candidates or voters.
In terms of like healthcare pricing and things like that, it is not the midterm issue that we've seen it be in previous midterm elections.
Healthcare may feel like it's removed from politics, but politics have a huge impact on regulations, payments, and trends in the healthcare sector. So let's dive in to the current state of politics.
Well, welcome to the Gary Bisbee Show. Delighted today to have two very distinguished political operatives, consultants, and pollsters. Joining me are Jay Campbell, a partner at Hart Research Associates, and Jim Hobart, a partner at Public Opinion Strategies. Hey guys, thanks so much for doing this.
Thank you. Excited.
Hey Jarrett, how are you?
Great. Well, let's talk about the midterms. Jim, I'll stay with you or start with you. But for both of you, just share a little bit your thoughts on the current state of the political environment as we close in on the midterm election. Where are we? What are voters thinking? And how would you describe the state of the current political environment? Jim, I'll start with you and then go to Jay.
Yeah, I think the current reality is what we have seen in midterm elections for a number of years now. It's that they tend to favor the party that's out of power. Right now, the Democratic Party is in power, so that means that it is very likely, just historically, that this midterm is going to favor the Republicans. And we are certainly seeing that begin to play out. It looked like that was definitely was going to happen 6 months ago. About 6 weeks ago, things trended a little bit towards Democrats. And now as we are getting closer to Election Day, it looks like things are trending back towards Republicans, really up and down the ballot, governor's races, Senate races, and House races as well. Again, now some of that is driven by some poor economic indicators and things like that.
Jay, your perspective?
I by and large agree with Jim. I mean, it's challenging, and that's from the Democratic perspective, it's challenging, and that's probably a measured way of saying it. In addition to the sort of historical headwinds that Jim alluded to for the party in power, we have inflation is up, we have interest rates up, and we have the market down. This is not a great combination of things for the party in power to be dealing with 20 days before an election.
So Jay, you talked about the economic issues, cost of living, interest rates, and the market. What other issues, are there other things that are at play that you're seeing in different races and across the country that voters are really thinking about the election?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, inflation really does trump all. In the CNBC poll, I think 44% chose it as one of their top two most important issues. Everything else was upwards of 13 to 14 points lower than that. So it really is the top thing that people have in mind. For independents, who, as we all know, are the white whale that each of our parties are chasing, it is by far the top issue, and nothing else even comes close to it. Beyond that, Democrats are obviously focused a lot on abortion and post Supreme Court decision in the Dobbs case, climate change, and threats to democracy. In our recent poll, the threats to democracy was actually the number one issue for Democrats, small d democracy, obviously. And then Republicans are really as focused as they have been in recent years on border security and immigration. It is, I think, the number one issue for the Republicans in the poll, and maybe to a slightly lesser degree on crime. But that's still very much on the minds of Republican voters as well. But the economy really is. I mean, I told my wife I was going to be talking to you guys, and she said, well, showing her own age also, it's just what James Carville said. It's the economy again, stupid.
Jim, how about from your perspective?
Yeah, no, and I totally agree with Jay. I think the economy still trumps all. And then obviously there's been a lot of focus from Republicans, especially in some specific races. When you look at like the Pennsylvania Senate race and the Wisconsin Senate race, to use two examples, on crime, you're seeing that some gov races too. So I think that's right there too. I think, again, the reality is, and the challenge when you're facing one of these tough political environments is that the party that's facing the tough environment, you typically have one good punch to throw, right? And then you throw that punch, and I think we saw that in late August, early September. The abortion attacks on Republicans were very effective. I mean, there's no doubt about that was a problem. But that punch is thrown, and now it's kind of like, okay, well, where can Democrats go next? They can't go to the economy. There's some pretty effective messaging on Republicans on crime. And so you see all these Democratic operatives saying like, oh, well, they need to change the subject. And it's like, but where do they go?
Jay, it's November 9th, and Democrats have picked up one or two seats in the Senate, significantly outperformed expectations in the House. Maybe it's holding the House, maybe it's only, losing, 5 to 8 seats. And they've outperformed at the state level. Walk me through how Democrats were successful in getting there.
Well, I sort of think in terms of three things. Number one, rank and file Democrats, particularly Democratic women, are sufficiently incensed about abortion and threats to democracy, the rhetoric they hear related to what they interpret to be threats to democracy from some Republican candidates that they show out in force. I mean, we all saw early in this year when motivation of Democratic voters in our polling was noticeably lower than that of Republicans, which gave the people on my side a heck of a lot of heartburn. As we've gotten closer to the election, that has evened out much more, as you would expect it to anyway. But I think that a lot of these issues we've been discussing have added to that. Secondly, the reinvigorated efforts of the Democratic Party to reach out to Latino voters will have shown some positive feedback, and that will have worked. If that is the case, that's going to add a lot to our efforts in Arizona and Nevada in particular, maybe Florida, maybe Texas a little bit. And then the one that I'm least sure about, honestly, is younger voters. They've been just beaten down over the past 2.5 years with the pandemic. Really negative views on just about everything, and politics is probably very much up there with where those negative views are. If they can sort of get past their concerns and they do it ultimately show up to vote, I think that will be an important step as well. And then honestly, I have a fourth also ran idea, which is, let's not forget that candidates matter. I mean, what we all do is a lot focused on this national environment and where the political winds are blowing. But on a race by race basis, some of this is going to be really important, and candidate quality matters. And I would say particularly on the Republican side, some questionable candidates or candidates of questionable quality who, at the end of the day, voters may reject, and one or two of those going one way can make a big difference.
Jim, same question, but the outcome is reversed. Republicans have won control of the Senate, 25 plus seats in the House, and netted a couple of governorships. What drove Republican electoral success?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing will be winning independents by a double-digit margin. I think, to Jay's point, in the spring we maybe saw like, hey, we're going to see a disinterested Democratic base and a fired up Republican base, similar to what we saw in 2010 and 2014. I don't think we're going to see that anymore. I think we're going to have historically high turnout. I think turnout in 2022 will be higher than it was in 2018, both nationally and in a lot of these competitive races. And because of that, that means for the most part, voters on both sides are going to show up. And so for Republicans to have a great year, they're going to need to win independents by, a healthy margin. And when you look at the results of wave elections, especially midterm elections, that tends to be what happens. In 2010 and 2014, Republicans won independents. In 2018, Democrats did. And right now, when you look at the numbers among independents, Jay mentioned that what a top concern inflation is for them. They're not big fans of the president. And when you see those two things, that tends to mean that independents broke the Republican way. And the other thing is in a lot of races, Republicans are going to have to hope that the environment overcomes, without speaking about the candidates individually. I think, look, in almost every single Senate race, Republicans will be outspent on the candidate side. So those are the two things: winning independents and then overcoming some spending disadvantages.
Jim, I'll stay with you for a second. It seems like you talked about high turnout levels. It seems that elections are increasingly about turning out the base. Do persuadable voters still exist the way they used to? And how do you energize the base while trying to capture the persuadable voters that are out there?
I'm of the perspective that persuasion is still very important. And I hope I'm right, because persuasion is a lot more interesting than just being like, oh, we got to turn out the base. Then it becomes then polling becomes less important. It's more just about knocking on a bunch of doors. So I think that persuasion remains. And another thing is sometimes I think we conflate the two, right? To Jay's point, if you're a base Democrat who only votes in presidential elections, well, then trying to get them to come out in 2022, you're trying to persuade them to vote. You're not trying to persuade them to vote between two candidates, but that's persuasion too. We battled that a lot in 2018. These Trump-only types that we needed to get out to vote. That's just as much persuasion as it is turnout. The way I think about things.
Right. Jay, let me ask you this: how do you kind of run that dual track of making sure you're energizing the base, but also trying to appeal to persuadable voters?
It's a fine needle to thread, for sure. And I'd be curious to know if the two of you sort of agree with this. You sort of figure, while it differs by district, it differs by state, obviously, that the persuadable universe is maybe 6 to 10% of the electorate, give or take. And they're part of the reason they are persuadable or undecided is they're much less engaged in the political world. They sort of pay less attention, either because they care less or because they just don't have the time. Partisans pay a lot more attention and are a lot easier to reach. So getting to the persuadables is trick number one. And then you just got to find your hook with them. And, unfortunately, the hook for those who are largely disengaged very often is a negative point or two about your opponent. It's unfortunate. It doesn't elevate the discourse, certainly. But at the end of the day, it's our job to win an election. And so we do what we got to do.
Final election 2022 question, and then I'll pivot to some other areas. We're a couple of weeks out. We're really in the final stretches of this midterm election. Jay, I'll start with you. What are you watching for over the final couple of weeks as we approach election day?
If 2000 was Florida, 2022 is Pennsylvania. For me, anyway. I can't speak for you, but we have two premier races here. The Senate race is a perfect microcosm, I think, of the entire political debate right now in many ways. And so as that goes, I think a lot of other races will probably go. And then the governor's race, which Jim sort of mentioned at one point for Josh Shapiro, It will be interesting. I think the conventional wisdom is that Shapiro doesn't have a lot of threat of losing to Doug Mastriano. That said, I think the margin in that race is going to be really important. If Mastriano has a better than expected showing, that's going to be a pretty good, it's going to augur, I think, fairly well for Republicans across the country.
One thing that's always helpful to look at is spending decisions. You're going to have, especially the House-aligned groups. Look, the Senate races are all going to be fully funded, but by monitoring what the D-TRIP is doing, what NRCC is doing, what CLF and HMP are doing in terms of where they're spending, where they're cutting spending, that'll give you a good idea of where the winds are blowing too. And I do think that, to Jay's point, one thing that's going to be interesting is you are likely to have some Democrats who lose in Biden plus 10, plus 8 type seats. But I think you're going to have some Democrats who win in Biden plus 1, plus 2, plus 3 type seats. And it's because they're just better candidates and they've run better campaigns.
I want to change topics and talk about healthcare for a minute. This is a very big healthcare contingent of folks who watch this. Guys, where does healthcare rank as an issue to voters right now?
Well, when you look, it's pretty low, quite frankly. It's in 2018, it was, I believe, the top issue, if I'm remembering correctly. And you're just not seeing too many healthcare focused ads. Some Dems are running some ads on prescription drugs and what they were able to do with that. And I believe it was the Inflation Reduction Act. But this election is economy, crime. You can also look, abortion is a healthcare issue. There's no doubt about that. So, but in terms of like healthcare pricing and things like that, it is not the midterm issue that we've seen it be in previous midterm elections.
I completely agree. To even put it in the second tier right now would be a little generous, I think. And which, to be honest, from my perspective, is a little bit of a shame because it's one of the issues where Democrats do still maintain an advantage over Republicans at the macro level. To see it sort of coming down further is not something I enjoy saying, but I believe it is the case as well.
Jay, the Jim just mentioned the Inflation Reduction Act. It had some pieces, some healthcare components in it. How are voters reacting to that? The healthcare components of that legislation?
Jim mentioned the prescription drug piece. That is exceedingly popular. I mean, really across the political spectrum. Donald Trump recognized this. He took his eye off the ball, as Donald Trump was wont to do. But he recognized the popularity of prescription drugs and bringing prices down. Joe Biden and the Democratic members of Congress were able to get that done, and I think ultimately that's going to be a feather in the Democrats' cap. If not in 20 days, then in 2024. I very strongly believe that to be the case.
While we're on the topic of healthcare, what role, if any, does COVID-19 have in this election?
Conversation has gone past COVID. I mean, Jim, I don't know if you feel like it maybe had some role in some Republican primaries, possibly.
Yeah.
But I think now in late October, it's pretty minimal.
I was looking at Georgia the other day. That it's when you compare 2018 to 2022, the early vote results are basically double in terms of the number of people who are doing it. And one reason for that is they got used to doing it in 2020. Yeah. So I think from that standpoint, maybe a little bit, but no one. I mean, I can't remember the last time I saw an open end where someone mentioned COVID as an issue.
Let's change topics again. Over the last decade, we've seen a little bit of a shift in realignment between the two parties. Look back to the 2000 election, George W. Bush won white college-educated voters by 15 points. In 2020, Joe Biden won that same group of people by 16 points. In 2000, George W. Bush won non-college-educated white voters by 6 points, and Donald Trump won that same group by 36 points. So some, dramatic swings in terms of the composition of the parties. You've got Hispanic men that I think are sort of breaking to the right in some ways. Talk to me from a campaign, elections, polling standpoint, what that might mean for future elections, kind of this sort of realignment in some ways of the two political parties?
Well, I think one thing that you've seen it do is it's in some ways it's shifted the battlefield, right? The reason that Georgia and Arizona have come on the board as really real swing states is because they have a higher population of white college grads. Now, they also both have pretty sizable minority populations, which makes a difference there too. But I think that's one way that it's done things. And you are seeing states, we used to call them the big blue wall. The Wisconsins, the Michigans, and the Pennsylvanias become much more competitive. And that's one of the primary reasons for that. Just from a polling standpoint, it makes our job a little bit harder because for two reasons. One, white non-college men are the hardest people to get on the phone. And then the other thing is white non-college men tend to live in places where we just aren't going to get as many interviews because of the way we choose to do surveys. Republicans win or lose in a lot of ways these days based on how high the margins are able to run up with these white non-college graduates, and they're the toughest group to reach.
I completely agree. And you did, Jarrett, mention Hispanic men. They're a particularly interesting group these days as well. My colleague, Eileen Cardona, has done a lot on the Latino electorate. And she and I have conversations periodically about Latino men in particular. And just trying to understand that population of voters it's interesting and it's challenging. There was this demography is destiny strain of thought in the Democratic Party, which proved to be wishful thinking to a certain degree. And part and parcel of that is the assumption for a long time that a Latino voter is a Latino voter is a Latino voter. And it couldn't be further from the truth. We don't consider all white voters to be the same. We don't consider all black voters to be the same. Why would we do this for Latinos?
Yeah, and just to piggyback on something else you brought up, Jarrett, with Hispanics, we're starting to see that same. Yeah, there's some difference by gender, but there's also that break depend on whether they have a college degree or not. Just like we're seeing with white voters, we're starting to see some real differences between Hispanics with college degrees and Hispanics without.
And religion. Both of our firms just did a poll for Telemundo. Eileen in my shop was working on that, and she was telling us how there's a significant religious split between Catholic Latinos and evangelical Latinos, just as there are among
Right.
Catholic and Catholic and evangelical whites. So, I mean, imagine, that people have different attitudes based on these things.
Jim, you mentioned kind of closing on the end here, but I want to ask one thing because I know it's on the minds of folks watching. You touched on the issue with a little bit of the issues with polling. Obviously, your respective firms poll for a lot of members of U.S. Congress or U.S. House, a lot of members of the U.S. Senate, a lot of governors. So you clearly have strong track records as firms. What changes have you looked at or are employing with respect to polling as we're going into these 2022 midterm elections coming off of 2020?
Yeah, so one thing that we're doing, well, I'll start with phones. We are doing partially on our own volition and partially at the encouragement of our phone centers. We're doing far more cell phone interviewing than we ever have before. In a lot of states, we are between 70 to 80% cell phone interviews. Part of that is because people just do not pick up their landline anymore. They're actually more likely to pick up their cell phone. And part of that is people don't have landlines anymore. And so we have shifted to that. We are doing this cycle more text to web than we ever have. So that's reaching people via text message and asking them to click on a link and fill out a survey. So it's really still an online survey, but it's a little bit more representative because you're working off a list of phone numbers rather than a list of or an online panel. There's 6 to 10% of voters who are persuadable. Well, what that means is that races are just going to be much, much closer.
And then the other thing that we're doing is being more aggressive about how we weight our surveys. When we get the raw data back, it's never been the case that the raw data is absolutely picture perfect for what the population should look like. And so there's always been a certain amount of waiting to adjust for that, giving if you don't have enough Black respondents, giving a little bit more weight to each Black respondent's answers until it's balanced to what the population should look like. The tricky thing that we've all learned, much to our own chagrin, over the past 4 years is this sort of issue of the fancy term for it is systemic non-response bias, where it used to be that if you didn't get on the phone your prime respondent in Phoenixville, Pennsylvania, who is a white male in his mid-40s with a college degree, then if you found another white male with a college degree the next town over, there's a good chance there was going to be a lot of similarities between them, and therefore you haven't hurt the accuracy of your sample. And so we're trying to come up with ways to fix that. And look, if someone's not going to talk to you, you can't make them do it. That's the unfortunate part of our job. So you got to figure out some other way to account for their attitudes.
Well, final question, guys. This has been terrific. Want to close on hopefully a bit of an uplifting question. You and your two firms, our two firms, have worked together on a lot of bipartisan issues over the years for various organizations in and around DC and around the country. And I want to get your take from each of you. What's one reason that you're encouraged about the future of our politics in terms of bipartisanship, and what's one thing that gives you some hope or some optimism looking down the road?
Look, regardless of the political party that you're in, I think that you can see that the country has real challenges ahead of it. We could name plenty of them. And my hope is that people eventually start to say, hey, let's at least try to hammer out some type of common ground and get these things done. Honestly, some of my favorite work that I do these days is when I am partnering with either a Democratic firm or center-right type of think tank on policy issues. That type of stuff is a lot of fun because you can develop these unique coalitions and try to get things done. So much of campaign work, especially federal campaign work now, is okay, let's get 95% of Republicans. They're going to get 95% of Democrats. And let's see if we can win independents. If it's a good year for us, we will. If it's a bad year for us, we won't. Them's the breaks, so to speak. So yeah, I'm certainly optimistic that, or try to be optimistic that some real policy solutions can be achieved.
It's the hope and the optimism, the hope that politics won't get in the way of good policy. The work we've done together, Jim and I did work together last year around clean energy. That is an area where we can find agreement among citizens of different colors that there needs to be a path forward for clean energy. I do a lot of work with Republicans, a former colleague of yours in particular, on children's issues and early childhood education. Everybody needs childcare, whether you're a Republican. Every parent needs childcare, whether you're a Republican or a Democrat. And everybody wants good childcare. And so the idea of making childcare better is a place where those on opposite ends of the partisan spectrum can come together and actually do something for the American people. Everyone does want to bring the cost of prescription drugs down, including Donald Trump and Joe Biden. Imagine. Now, can you see the two of them working together to do it? No, that's the problem. That's where politics gets in the way.
Hey guys, this has been absolutely terrific. Really appreciate your time. I know you're in the middle of a very intense period and appreciate you taking some time. And yeah, thank you both so much.